Filmmakers make films, but films make filmmakers. From blockbuster premieres to grindhouse theaters, late night cable to the local video store, there is no greater classroom for aspiring filmmakers than cinema itself. Join your host, Eric Skwarczynski, as he dives deep into the minds of legendary directors, producers, actors, and more to discover their biggest influences and to explore the impact their films are leaving behind. This is Film School. Grab your popcorn. Class is about to begin.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Scott, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of your interviews, and typically when you listen to people who work in the industry, there's a story of a childhood movie that inspired them, and they said, I want to learn how to make these. That's not the case with you, and I was fascinated by that. You mentioned like appreciating movies growing up and enjoying them, but the flip from being a consumer to wanting to be on the other side of the camera happened a lot later. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what that looked like and how that developed?
Growing up, I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and it was pre-video. So anybody who made anything was making 8mm films. You had to know how to edit it. You had to do. I just wasn't into it. It just wasn't my thing. Now, I was athletic. I played baseball, basketball. I wanted to be a writer since the 5th grade. So that was always in my mind, not screenwriting per se. I wanted to be a novelist or a journalist,
Yeah.
And so I geared myself toward that and baseball. I had a minor league tryout, but you only go so far,
Right.
I had the skills, but it wasn't going to be my career. And I went to college for journalism. I went to Boston University my freshman year, and it was a good journalism program, and I got into it. And I was writing for the school paper, doing reviews around Boston. And I had a writing assignment in a graduate level short story class that I had taken that I had gotten into as a freshman. And it was to write a short screen, 1 week, just write a screenplay. I mean, I hadn't even looked at a screenplay ever or a book and
Right.
of course, we weren't really running around with computers and looking on the internet at anything. So I figured I saw a couple scripts in the library, and like I said, I had always enjoyed movies, so watched a lot of movies. But I wrote this script as an exercise in this class, and it was an economy of writing, and then trying to get something across that really intrigued me. Of course, it's similar to playwriting. It's different, a little different, but it's certainly much different than prose. And I liked it. I really liked it.
Right.
So I started thinking I really was interested in having a journalism career, which later in life, I still wish to a certain extent I'd had, because I do a lot of true stories.
Right.
And I do a lot of digging in a way that's reminiscent of being a journalist. When I write the things I write, I find things often when I'm writing that people who have written books about the subject go, how do you find that out? So I know I sort of had a penchant for that, but I also wanted to tell stories.
Right.
I wanted to make stuff up, basically. In journalism, I started thinking, well, I can't go report on this thing and make everything up. That wouldn't really be fair, would it? And so
Right.
I looked around, and, it wasn't hard at the time to figure out. There was either NYU, BU had a film program, but I wasn't that excited about it. It was a good program, but not what I wanted. You didn't get your hands on the equipment soon enough. So
Sure.
it wasn't hard to find NYU, UCLA, and USC. There was really, people will say there was more than that, but really those were the top three. It's different. It's a little different now with other
Right.
schools, but that was it. And although I wanted to go to LA, I grew up in Pennsylvania being a Dodger fan. So I had no fear of Los Angeles, and I was looking forward to it, but I didn't think my parents weren't quite ready for, being 3,000 miles away. I don't know. I wasn't afraid of leaving home, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go that quickly. So I locked into NYU, got there, fell in love. I always wanted to live in New York, which was another thing. I dreamed as a kid of living by myself or in an apartment in New York. So here I was, I got into NYU and I had an apartment in New York in the Village, and it was perfect. It was absolutely amazing. The program was run by a gentleman named Haig Manoogian, who was, somebody that Marty Scorsese still talks about to this day. And it was an extraordinary, and that's really what got me going. I was in New York in the late 70s. It was an exciting time. That sort of, studio, which is now independent, but studios were making, a studio made Mean Streets. It would never happen today, right?
No.
Warner Brothers made Mean Streets, and Coppola's work, and, John Cassavetes was a big influence. I wasn't as much into, although I like John Ford and Hitchcock, and I do, and I've studied them, I was more into that new world, Scorsese and Coppola and Cassavetes too. They're really indie style filmmaking. That's what intrigued me more. And New York really fit into that more than LA.
Right.
LA was always, the schools in LA were always geared more commercially. So I went to NYU, and I graduated and got out and started kicking around, driving a cab and working as a PA.
So you live taxi driver. You like Scorsese so much, you're like, I'll drive a taxi.
I did. I definitely did.
with Scorsese and Cassavetes and Coppola, was it something where obviously the types of films they were making where they capture that independent filmmaking, kind of breaking the rules of traditional cinema? Was that what you admired? Was the film themselves, or was it something of the spirit of a Scorsese, like the person and the business mindset of those independent filmmakers?
Yeah, I think it was the fact that they were telling stories, but they were in a sense making their own rules. Woman Under the Influence, and even before it, Husbands, Cassavetes films, people would say, wow, all that improvisation. And he would tell people, we rehearsed all that. It looks like some of it looks like improvisation, but we actually rehearsed all of that.
Right.
And it was this sort of the ability to show real life. Midnight Cowboy and movies like Five Easy Pieces, even Bob Rafelson as a director, somewhat this day unheralded, but an amazing director, who made these lifelike films that mimic life, but were, artifice to the extent that they were movies. Yeah. And I just love the idea of something real, something, gripping you that was real. So that's what I really fell in love with. And Coppola's stuff, look, Godfather and Godfather 2 are big movies, but before that, even, or after that, all of a sudden I'm God, The Conversation, The Conversation was breaking all kinds of rules. And, even more than Lucas, the funny thing is about George Lucas is he never broke any rules. He just decided he didn't want to live in LA. From my perspective, I don't, nothing wrong with him, but he made commercial movies.
Right.
The fact that he bucked Hollywood is really silly. He didn't buck Hollywood. He just lived in the Bay Area. That's all. He just didn't want to live in LA.
Right.
So these other guys, though, were doing stuff. Hal Ashby, Shampoo, and these things. They were doing things. They were looking at the world, and they were coming up with, points of view. So that got me. And New York was a good time. It was a good time to be there. Sidney Lumet, Serpico, commercial movie, but also with kind of a great edge.
Right.
All these kinds of people were popping up. Woody Allen's great period, and the good stuff, Manhattan and Before Manhattan, and all this cool stuff that was happening. Dustin Hoffman, even Marathon Man, and John Schlesinger, and all these great filmmakers were doing very cool but commercial things. So that got me, and that's what I wanted to do. And I worked a little bit in New York. I worked for about a year after I graduated. I worked as a PA on Saturday Night Fever. I worked on a film called Short Eyes, which was a Pulitzer Prize winning drama by Miguel Pinheiro. But I got the bug finally. I finally was ready to go to LA. I knew New York was really rough back then. There were very few independent films made. The word independent wasn't even the word we used.
No.
There really weren't a lot of movies being made, and everybody who worked would kill each other to get the one job that was coming up. Oh, Martin Bregman's producing a movie. Oh, Al Pacino's company's doing a movie. Up, Woody Allen, and that was it. Like that was the whole winter, right?
Yeah.
Or summer, So I knew I had to go, and I was ready to go to LA. And I moved to LA in the summer of 1977. I moved on the day of the major brownout in New York City. I moved that morning, and I never looked back. And I got into making sort of the B movies. I worked for New World and Crown International. Wow. I made a movie called Galaxina. I was a production manager, and built my experience by having a bigger job. I was a production manager on Galaxina, but it was I would have never done that if I was at a studio. I've been a PA for 10 years.
Yeah.
So, and on those films, like on oh God, I made a movie called Alligator, and I was one of the production managers, but the other production manager was Tom Jacobson, who was an executive at Fox and ran John Hughes's company. Gail Hurd was my PA.
Wow.
Louis Teague directed the movie, and John Sayles wrote it. And this all happened in these B movies, an Alligator in the sewers of LA. But it was a great tumult of time, to learn your craft, learn it while you're young, which is why I was able to start. I found a script at this company called Atlantic Releasing that had just made this movie called Valley Girl. And I saw Valley Girl, and I knew the people at Atlantic, and I thought, these guys, they're taking this old genre, sort of this B-movie genre, but they're doing something with it. Something's changing here. Yeah. A woman directed it, and it wasn't nudity, it wasn't TNA. It was something different. I went to that company. I said to them, you guys are onto something. I'm thinking the same thing, sort of kind of making A movies on a B body, right? I called it A movie head, B movie body. And I brought them a project. They made it with Willem Dafoe, and it didn't do that well, but it was a great introduction, and we liked each other. And they said, we have this script we want you to take a look at. Why don't you just take a look at this thing called Teen Wolf? And I looked at the script. It's very funny. Worked with the writers, brought on a director, got Michael J. Fox committed for a very short period of time, where we were forced to prep the film in 4 weeks and shoot it in 4 weeks. And, they asked us, can you prep this film in 4 weeks? Well, you're producing a movie with Michael J. Fox. You don't say no, right? Even if you think it's impossible. And we pulled it off. And, Teen Wolf was a studio quality movie for $1.8 million that made more money than just about any studio comedy that year, including one of John's films. It went up against, I think, Weird Science, and it made more money than Weird Science, which John pointed out to me later when I worked with him on Home Alone. So, I mean, that's how things started getting going, to the point where I knew Sam Goldwyn, and the same thing happened. He had been developing the script for Mystic Pizza, but wasn't happy with it, and brought me on, and I came up with a bunch of ideas, which he liked, hired another writer, and then hired Alfred Urey to finish the rewrite. And then we were able to cast Julia and a new group of people. Sam, to his credit, allowed us to go after new people. There were a bunch of people who liked the script and wanted to be in it. It was the current Brat Pack, good people, Ali Sheedy, Phoebe Cates. We all got calls about it. And I said to Sam Goldwyn, I want to have my own. I want to have our own Brat Pack. He said, go ahead. So we found Julia and Lily Taylor and Annabeth Gish, and it was extraordinary. So, we were sort of trying to create a world of making kind of like almost studio quality films, but independent, with some independent spirit, but commercial. I should say independent films that could be commercial.
Right.
And that's what Teen Wolf was too. I wasn't invited. I never got invited to Sundance until Smoke Signals, because I made independent films, but they were commercial. And Teen Wolf was never going to show its face at Sundance. Right.
Well, it's easy now. So like now looking back, you look at all these films, like I laughed when it was like your first job as production assistant on, Saturday Night Fever, which is that's unreal. That's the first movie you get to be associated with, even in a smaller role. Like that's an amazing
Yeah.
it's an amazing movie to say like, oh, I started there. I cut my teeth on a movie that's a classic. And then you go forward and it's Teen Wolf and it's Mystic Pizza and it's all these movies that have massive acclaim now. When you're working on them, going from place to place at a rapid pace, did you sense that at all? Did you sense like
Well,
this project has gravity and it's going to go somewhere and this one's a job, like,
well, to some extent, yes. What I would say is you don't ever think, if you're thinking clearly, oh my God, I think this is going to be a big hit. You never do that. I think people do that once in a while. It's a mistake. It's not something I would ever do.
everyone that comes to Hollywood to act is going to do that.
But I think when I got my hands on Mystic Pizza, I knew, we could turn this into something special, and it felt special making it. And that's the best it can be, to make something as high quality it can be, and then hopefully the audience will get it. Teen Wolf wasn't Shakespeare, but it was incredibly funny and turned the genre on its head a little bit. And that was very cool. A lot about that was very cool. So that had its own thing, Smoke Signals really did the same thing. We had an amazing script by the writer Sherman Alexie, who wrote, what could have been, every time people think about Native Americans, it's got to be heavy and sweat lodges and all that stuff. And Sherman, being just a human being, wrote a script about what it's like to be a Native American, but what we all go through. And it was funny. It was sad. It told jokes about itself, so it wasn't this ponderous stuff. I noticed it on Facebook every time. I don't do Facebook much, but people write to people, and then everything's serious. And I write a funny comment, and I think people are looking at each other going, are we allowed to laugh? Are we actually allowed to laugh?
Right.
I feel like, I always good at balancing out, comedy and drama, laughter and cheers, and trying to combine that into something, humanistic.
Well, but you see that with your influences. Yeah.
Yeah. You just push to make, I knew, Smoke Signals was an amazing script. I felt it was an amazing script. To this day, it's the best script I've ever worked on any movie. Critical Thinking came out very well recently, but Smoke Signals for me is the best script I've ever worked on. Been involved in. And you just knew it. I knew it right away. I knew it the second I picked it up and read it. I told my partner in Seattle, I was living in Seattle at the time, and we were going to go to Hollywood and get it funded. He was going to put up development money, but not anything else. And I read the script and I went to him and I said, we're funding the movie. He was a high net worth individual and there were some other people involved in the company. I said, no, not this one. This one you finance. This one puts us on the map. This puts a lot of people on the map. And he agreed. And it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, speaking about putting people on the map, I mean, that's another thing that stands out in your career is that there's, obviously, I think my audience has probably heard of Macaulay Culkin and Julia Roberts. And even like thinking back and look at, Mystic Pizza, which I love, like Lily Taylor, like we talk about Julia Roberts, like Lily Taylor, that was a first major role. And then even, I'm a huge fan of Extremities. I love that movie. And Farrah Fawcett, in a way, that's not her first role by any stretch, but that was one of the movies that changed the public perception of what kind of role she could take.
Absolutely.
Again, looking back, it's easy to say like, yeah, of course, like Julia, we'd all like to think we would cast Julia Roberts and we would find a Macaulay Culkin and a Lily Taylor and all these different people. How do you identify that star power sitting in a room with a piece of paper, a little bit of dialogue, and just seeing hundreds of people? How do you spot those stars? Because you've done it enough times where I think it's not an accident. I think there's something there.
No, I mean, I don't usually toot my own horn, but it's not an accident.
Toot away. Go ahead. I'll toot it for you.
That's when that started to happen, I started to realize I really had an instinct for this business because it's a creative, mostly creative instinct when you're sitting there and watching actors come in and out and in and out and in and out, and good ones, even ones that were close to her. if I guess if you're open, I don't want to say like your chakras are open, but if you're open to all of that, you feel it. For me, I always felt it. I could tell when she came in that was it. There are other people in the room too who all looked at each other and nodded the same way, but I knew she had it. There are other actors, I knew they just had something that somebody else didn't have. Right. And you just sense it. I still feel it. If I felt like I ever lost it, I'd probably quit, in all honesty. I feel like I'd quit. But it's a sense and a feeling, and it's really a strong feeling that comes from, I don't know. I'm not even sure where it comes from, but it came from somewhere, and it's still here inside me. And that's the best I can describe it.
Well, what comes from you and what you exude that's different from, I think, the stereotype of the producer. Because when I think producer, and I'm someone that sits and watches tons of behind the scenes and reads books, I know this isn't the case. But when I think of producer, you get the Hollywood image of the guy with the cigar with his feet on the desk and the suit saying whatever we need to do to make the most money. And with you balance those two things. It's the left brain, right brain. You've mentioned on other interviews, you've talked about, having that creative route. You went into it for love of storytelling. So how do you balance that artistic liberty, taking those risks, going for the unknown, Rat Pack, versus going with tried and true, trying to meet your day and make the money back at the box office? And how do you weigh those things out?
Well, they come in stages, early on in a project when you're casting, you can let yourself be free sort of creatively. And as you start to coalesce into the cast you've picked and who the director is, then you start to use those other aspects of yourself. Now you have to get a little bit more practical. How are we going to do this? Can this director really pull this off? Can this director work with actors? Are they going to faint dead away on the first problem that happens on the set, right? Which does happen. Then I start to bring the practical things in after we've gotten the focus on the script, the focus on the actors, and the picking of the director. To me, those are almost 100% creative. And after that, I start to bring in, as a producer, the management of all of this and working with the production manager to make sure the budget's going to match the vision of the director and all of those things, and then keep everybody focused and not let the train go off the tracks. The easiest thing is to not keep focus. You have to say, we're doing this and we're doing this way. Yes, there's there's little things that come up, but you have to stick to the plan. Otherwise it's a mess. And some people think, we had this plan, but now we're on the set and we're going to do this instead, or it doesn't really work that well that way. And you have to keep, the second part of it is very organized. It's that thing. I can, the left brain, I'm a creative person and I write. The right brain, I'm extraordinarily organized. Like even my desk, it's just like things are like, it's the way I am. My kitchen, my desk, I'm very organized. And I do that on purpose because you have to have rules, in terms of how you make things and how you produce things. And you have to do things, you have to you can learn new things. And I do all the time, but you have to make sure you keep focus on getting to that place, especially if you're getting financed by people, people give you money, whether it's a corporation or whether it's individual people. And I've dealt with individual people a lot. And, they ask you questions. You got to have answers, Right. You can't just say, I don't know, tomorrow, we'll see how tomorrow is. It could be really interesting. You have to already be pre-planned for what might go wrong tomorrow. So right. I think being able to solve problems, see problems almost before they happen, and be ready to deal with them and fix them very, very, very quickly. And right. to keep the entire crew, all the key people focused on making the same movie all the time. The costume designer isn't running off doing something strange. Oh, I thought the director said, well, the director never told anybody else. Always keeping everything focused so that my one rule is always everybody knows the same information. There's no hoarding of information. Yes, some people think it's powerful to have their little pocket of information that nobody else knows. I'm not a believer in it. I'm not a believer in chaos. Some directors believe in chaos. I'm not a believer in it. I don't think anything good comes of it generally. And I just keep things focused so that the director, is comfortable and able to do their work.
Yeah, it's interesting with that context and knowing your inspirations, because you mentioned you liked films that were real life. They had the artifice, obviously, it's fictionalized. There's that veneer, that slight Hollywood veneer over it, but it's a real life. You feel like you're placing the camera in someone's house or in their, their pizza place or wherever it is, or in their high school. And, what's amazing is you mentioned, a lot of these films, like not so much Scorsese, but if you look at Coppola, his early work and things like that, you feel this sense like there's a lot of improvisation and there's that kind of, controlled chaos in a sense. And in Mystic Pizza is a perfect example. That feels that same way. It feels like that slice of life. It feels like it breathes and there's a lot of wiggle room, but it sounds like how that happens is within the structure of knowing what you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It was scripted.
Yeah. They wrote a script for it. How about that?
Yeah, you allow for some, but I've noticed most of the time when there's a lot of heavy improvisation. In a film I directed called Family Prayers, with Joe Mantegna and Ann Archer and Paul Reiser, Patti LuPone, Paul improvised all the time. Mm-hmm. Now, he would always do the scene, but there would be a point where he'd keep going. And it was fun and it was funny. And we used 20% of it, not more than 20, because if it's after the scene, it's after the scene. There's a dynamic and a tension to the scene, dramatic tension. And if you go past that, usually it doesn't work that well.
Right.
It's not that you don't want actors to have the freedom to move around a little bit and come up with something fresh. Everybody does that. But to go off, it's too hard within the structure, especially if you have a really good screenplay. Why would you want to do that?
Right.
You're dealing with real people and their emotions. And sometimes the other actors aren't always prepared for it. Some actors are, of course, they're ready, but some actors aren't as prepared for that. And, it makes it uncomfortable. So,
Right. Well, I think that's the reason a film like Home Alone, which had all the potential, and I'm sure you never talk about Home Alone, no one ever brings that up, but the obscure art film Home Alone that you worked on, that's a film where there's a lot of ways in which that becomes a forgotten movie. There's a lot of ways in which that becomes a sloppier, improvised, kind of forgettable comedy. But I think the reason that movie works is that it is so structured. The jokes are, a lot of comedy now, you have exactly what you described. You can tell they set up one camera here on the other actor, and a wide shot, and they improvise and they use the best improvisation for the shot. Whereas Home Alone, there's a lot of visual gags. There's a very structured, I mean, especially with the traps, obviously, but even with the visual humor of him in the mirror and things like that, that doesn't happen just by planting it and forgetting about it and not getting very specific in how you want to structure that out.
I mean, there were some things like even the mirror, like Chris did have Mac play around, a little bit and with that. But otherwise, the improvisation, Catherine O'Hara, of course, is a master in doing for improvisation, and John Candy was pretty good at it. But so when we had them sitting next to each other, talking, whether it was, where was it, in that truck or whatever they were in, and that's the time to do it, right? Yeah. Just let them go. And we did. We let them go over and over, long stuff, lots of stuff. And we didn't use all of it, but we used a lot of it. And there are that's a controlled situation where improvisation works.
Right.
It wasn't in a scene that was already dramatically tendered.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It was in a scene where they're sitting on a bench in a truck with other musicians around them, and they could just start talking to each other. Perfect opportunity to keep going, right? Keep going. And Mac had that opportunity in front of the mirror. In fact, if I remember right, even this, he kind of came up with himself. So Chris let him do that because, look, it was just a camera and the mirror and the kid, right?
Yeah. Right.
But those are good situations to do that with. But all the other gags and everything, you couldn't.
They're so structured and so organized. Yeah. I'm kind of curious. So obviously, again, the artistic mind has these ideas and concepts and things and what you want. And you've mentioned the business side, and obviously, especially shooting on film, every foot of film is costing you money. There's money just rolling and rolling. But I'm curious with the artistic decisions and things that you feel passionate about in the script process, or maybe something that worked really well in table reads and auditions. Is there anything that you ever felt very passionate about artistically that for the production, overall it'd be better to cut it, where it was a, kind of a gut wrenching moment? Like, I can't believe we had to get rid of that. Because I know Scorsese obviously famously despises the blood in Taxi Driver, that they had to turn brown for the rating. Is there anything like that you can remember just feeling gutted over a decision where you had to choose one or the other?
Not really. I mean, in critical thinking, we had more stuff. We had actually more scenes with Michael K. Williams that just didn't seem to fit into the final movie, that were, really good, really interesting. And it was Michael K. Williams. He could read the phone book and be interesting.
Yeah.
And it is probably, out of everything I've done, the one movie where we had to really make decisions on some things to cut that we really, liked, but just didn't. It was like a different movie. It was like a different dramatic point that was like almost like a different movie. So they're not in the film, and some of it had to do with him, just not his acting, just the storyline of him being one of the fathers of one of the kids of the chess players. So, but not too much else. There's probably something that I'm forgetting.
I blocked out the trauma of whatever situation that was.
Trying to remember if there's anything in Home Alone. There are bits and pieces, nothing big. The critical thinking, although it's more recent and easier to remember, it also did actually have some things that we knew we had to cut out. No, not too much.
Yeah. Do you have a preference? So, working on films like that are a smaller drama and things like that, and you've also worked on movies that have a larger budget and more. Do you prefer one or the other? Do you prefer working in the big studio movie, or do you prefer more the more art house or dramatic or independent type of film?
Well, I've had success in both, but I like the independent ones because you're more in control. You don't have a lot of outside voices. The people who are making the film are a really small group of people who rely on each other, create a family, which is a lot harder to do on the bigger movies because there's a lot of outside control. There's outside influences from distributors, financiers, studios, and the like. People who make phone calls at 4 PM who are bothered by something right when you're on set, and you get dragged off the set in some moment you need for somebody in a studio to ask you some, relatively minor question that just gets them off the hook for their job. So I don't really like it as much, although lately I'm involved in my own stuff that's bigger, 10 to 20 million, a couple things over 20 million, but they're still kind of independent, but commercial, but just with a bigger canvas, and are being funded essentially independently, with some, distributor involvement and foreign sales involvement, but less of a lot of hands, not a lot of hands. I guess I, in a sense, I do prefer the indie stuff, because it's more fun to just have this little group of people and know it's up to you, your little platoon. It's up to your platoon to make this movie, and you don't get a lot of outside static.
Right.
And that's enjoyable. And I think I've made, my best work that way.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that you can do a lot with a little bit of money. It sounds like it's not so much the budget that kills movies more than the bureaucracy. It's going back and forth, and the interruptions, and the 1,000 hands, on one movie. I interviewed somebody recently who has worked on a lot of Marvel movies, and he's worked on really small micro budget movies. And, that's the thing that he mentioned, was he just said it's hard to scale up that family atmosphere when you're dealing with 3 units and hundreds of people. And, he said he liked that $20 million range where you have the feeling of an independent family while also having some money to do something,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's well said. It's a little harder right now, the $3, $4, $5 million films. It's also, quite frankly, people have to make a living, and it's, that's good at a certain age. It's not as good when you have 3 kids and, other things. You just have to evolve,
Right.
that way too. You have to be practical too. I'm in the DPA, I'm in the Writers Guild, I'm in the Academy, I'm in all of that stuff. And I work through all of those systems, even if I'm making, an $8 million or $10 million movie. I think when I make a $10 million movie, somebody else would probably spend 30.
Hmm.
And I know that for a fact. I'm not making that up. That's sort of my MO. Well, Scott makes a film for 5 and everybody else would spend 15 or 18. Or he makes a film for 10 and it's 20 or 25. That's what I do.
Right.
Because I don't mind it. I don't mind putting the money on the screen.
Right.
And not putting it into perks and shit that's just, terrible, and a waste of time.
Yeah, definitely. No, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, sense too, like $5 million isn't what $5 million was when you're making these independent films. So, it's changed and it's gotten more expensive. And in that vein, obviously a large piece of this is marketing. And I'm curious, obviously, I mean, I keep circling back to Scorsese. I mean, Scorsese's been very vocal about the trend of, the big budget superhero movies dominating the theaters. From what I can see looking back, it seems like there was always those types of movies. They've just changed into superheroes. It used to be Star Wars. It was all these other films. But do you feel more of that now with streaming and the amount of movies getting made? Do you feel like it's getting harder and harder to stand out, in the market?
Well, on one hand, when the streamers started to take over, not that I'm clairvoyant, but a few years ago, people would ask me at, panels, like, where do you see all this going? 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I sort of defined this, what's happening now. Others did too. I'm not, like I said, I wasn't being clairvoyant. I just saw it coming. It just took a little longer. We used to talk about, people will stay at home, VOD, $4, $6. And it's like, but it took a while and it happened finally, right? So on one hand, it's allowed for a lot more voices all over the world. As we see, they pick up stuff from all over the world. However, Netflix is still clamoring after movie stars, just like studios used to do.
Yeah.
We still are making films for 50, 60, 70 million. I mean, they don't even want to make a film for 3 million. I think we thought 3 years ago, this is the place we're going to take all our great indie stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Amazon did it a little bit, but none of them are really doing that, what we thought. And it is an opportunity for more voices, for more people, for more work, because they need more. So that part's good. They're making more. They can't make, 30 Chris Hemsworth, $80 million movies. They still have to make other stuff but they're making formulaic stuff. Everything's on airplanes, with vampires, or it's something, where somebody's chasing somebody. They tend to be pretty formulaic lately. I like to watch stuff from overseas because I find it more interesting.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a good place, at least for filmmakers, to bring their material, especially, now we go there first. I don't think about theatrical. I think about the streaming sale to Netflix, Amazon, all of them, HBO Max, whatever. Look, Scorsese, I've been a fan of his ever since NYU. And I even wrote him a letter. I was 2 years out of school. And I wrote him a letter and I typed it on a regular typewriter and sent it to him. And he wrote back to me about, what I should do. I'm out of film school. I'm trying to figure out what to do. And he wrote me a letter, which I still have. And I love his background, but, he made The Irishman for a lot of money. Cost a lot of money. Oh. So you know what? There's probably a $30 million version of Irishman instead of the $150 million version. And I'm not upset by it. I still love his work, but they're all doing it.
Yeah.
Everybody's like taking advantage. You're
not going to say no to it.
Yeah. And I don't know whether that's really good for the industry ultimately, because not every filmmaker can do that, and not every filmmaker is allowed to do that. And there still needs to be the voices, the new voices making the $2 and $3 and $4 million movies, or making, like this year with Minari and some of the other films that came out. We need them. We need them, and we also need some of those directors, to keep making those kinds of movies and not make a film and then get a Marvel movie because all they really wanted to do was get the big payday. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are people, who do that. And look, I don't begrudge people earning a living. I'd like to make more money too, but sometimes you got to do what you're here to do.
Yeah. Right.
And you have to accept who you are and do it the best you can, and you'll be found and you'll make money. You don't have to pander.
Well, and the restrictions have birthed some of the best filmmakers, some of the best work of Scorsese, like Scorsese's, some of his best films came when he was scraping together the funding to do it. Sam Raimi, I mean, obviously did an amazing job with the big budget as well as the small, but you look at Sam Raimi pre-Spider-Man, like amazing stuff in those limitations. Peter Jackson before Lord of the Rings, amazing stuff,
Absolutely. Look, Sam Raimi and Evil Dead, and still to this day, I remember the scene where it was a woman screaming and the eyeballs flying through the air and lands in her mouth. And Jesus, it's fantastic. There's also a film by a director named Stuart Gordon years ago who actually wrote Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and he made a film called Reanimator.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still think Reanimator is one of the great movies. The guy's carrying around his own head, right? It's genius. It's pure genius, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff to all of that as you get more money, you don't necessarily become a better filmmaker.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it is. It's amazing. And you could go down the list. So many starting in horror, Stuart Gordon, I mean, George Romero. Like I think of someone like that who never, I mean, he never really got his due, I think, as far as the budgets he wanted. I mean, even Land of the Dead was a smaller budget movie, but I mean, all of his films were so inventive with such limited resources and ability. Like before we wrap up, I do want to ask you, you've done a lot of work internationally. You mentioned focusing a lot on the movies coming out of the foreign market. I think people are at large starting to pay attention with Train to Busan and Parasite. Like we're starting to broaden our American, film education. Why are you so focused on the foreign film market, and how different has it been adjusting to that versus the U.S.?
For me, it's just really a matter of getting excited again. I was sort of, I do have projects here in the States and ones I like, don't get me wrong, but I got excited. I started traveling to Asia, and it just got me extremely excited about new stories, new ideas. For me, adventure, sort of Western expats in Asian culture, adventure, not so much action, but adventure, The Man Who Would Be King, great movies, even Graham Greene stuff, right? I love the milieu, and I've focused a lot of my time over the last few years in the Philippines because of the culture and because they speak English, and I'm making a bunch of things there with a couple filmmakers, one in particular, Pedring Lopez, who made a very successful film called Maria on Netflix a couple of years ago. And we're making a film called Counterplay. And it's a thriller that deals with a Western character, Western expat in the Philippines. So it's heavily Filipino, but it's a Western. It's also a mixture. It's in English, so it's for the world market, but it's got an exotic location. And I'm doing that with multiple projects, TV as well as feature film in different places, Thailand and Australia and, Malaysia and all over, because it's also got my juices going. I found new stories. I found great, interesting stories that I wouldn't find living, in the same place, or, the four walls of Beverly Hills, as people say. I have to get out. John Huston lived in Mexico. He lived in Ireland. I like people like that. Those are the people I respect from those days, which is long gone, but directors and filmmakers who wanted to live, amongst people and experience some other things. And I experience that all the time. So the things I've gotten my hands on or gotten interested in, still are commercial. They're very commercial. There's a film I want to do in Thailand with an American character, which is extraordinarily commercial, but it also deals with Thai culture and, a whole thing, So that's what excites me. That's what really excites me.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff coming out. I mean, even South Korea, I saw The Devil, was, when I saw that, I was like, this is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. Yeah. And I've never heard of it until now, it's interesting seeing this stuff start to get attention. And I think, I think more and more people are starting to look, they're getting bored with the kind of, a lot of the repetitive blockbuster style,
That's one of the problems of a Hollywood system making Marvel movies only.
Yeah.
I mean, right. It is the backlash of that. We can't just have that.
Right.
We just can't. There are too many people in the world that are not just 18 to 27. There are too many people who want to see stuff, who want to experience stuff. And you can't just keep throwing Marvel movies at everybody. And I think it's a reaction to that. And we don't talk about it much. People don't like to talk about it. But that's what's going on. And that's why, in a sense, that's the part where Scorsese's right.
Yeah.
He's indicating a situation that is a different spirit than what we're talking about here. We're talking about a totally different spirit. And some of these other countries are going to start kicking our ass.
Yeah.
Some of them already are. South Korea
is bringing it on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm trying to do that in the Philippines. Yeah. I'm trying to develop Filipino filmmakers to be able to do the same thing because I believe they can, because they're English speakers. They have a Western sense to them more than a lot of Asians. And I'm doing that. But we're not gonna stay on top in that sense if we keep doing this thing that satisfies one thing, which is box office. You have to be able to satisfy box office and creativity. It's a creative business. It's not just a business. It's not just art film. It's both. And you need to do both to keep people excited and interested.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, right before we wrap up, I just want to do a quick random round with you. I'm going to ask you some quick questions, some quick answers, and then we'll see if there's anything you want to promote here at the end. But I'm curious. I don't think I've seen any remakes in your credits, unless I missed it. But I'm curious, if you were given the green light to remake any film, what would you choose and why?
Probably Mystic Pizza, but in a funny way, to pick up where they left off. I don't think I'd want to remake it, part and parcel of the original movie. I think I'd want to tell the next story, which we talked about for a while, but it never got off the ground. And there were a variety of reasons for that, because I wanted to see where they went. Yeah. I think we just got a taste of who they were. And people still talk about those three girls at the time. They were young, not so much women. And I think I'd like to see them as women. It just, people always ask me that more than anything.
Yeah.
more than anything.
I feel like it would do well. I feel like you could. I mean, Sex and the City's doing that now with and Just Like That.
Yeah.
You know, they're doing that same kind of idea. Who
Look,
do you
the whole.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Who do you think is the most underrated filmmaker working today?
Oh, geez, the most underrated filmmaker today. Oh man. I know who's overrated, but that's not the question.
And it might not be
Least-
something you want to do.
at least
No.
in my mind. So, God, that's really tough. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Very tough. I would love to be able to answer it. Honestly, I'm thinking of foreigners, some of which, I would have said some of the Mexican directors, then all of a sudden they hit big a few years ago, Inarritu and those guys, and even, there was all of a sudden they popped forward. But he's not, I wouldn't call him underrated anymore.
No, certainly not.
Damn it. It's hard. I know but as soon as we're done, but.
What is a movie that your diehard fans would be surprised you enjoy?
Let's see. I don't know. The Untouchables.
Interesting. What do you think is the best decade of film history?
The 70s.
I could have guessed. I think with all your inspirations, I would have guessed 70s. What do you think is the worst decade of film history?
I probably, like the 50s. I know there was some film noir, but I pass right by it whenever I'm clicking around television. I mean, maybe the 90s weren't so great either, but the 50s probably just the least interesting to me.
Yeah. I always go back and forth between 50s and 90s. Tarantino said like the 50s was just such a homogenized, like bland time, and you had all the codes and things, like it wasn't just the filmmaker's fault. But I find myself only watching 50s movies if my 4-year-old's in the room and I have to watch something that's safe for her. But that sums it up. It's very safe films, whereas the 70s was not that. It was a very different time. Last question. What's the best piece of advice that you would give to an aspiring filmmaker who's listening to this?
Well, I think the most important thing I learned is you cannot skip the steps. You can't, get on TikTok and think you're an actor. You must go through the steps. You can't make a film in film school and think you're a director. You have to apprentice, whatever that means. I don't mean literally like a union. You have to apprentice. You have to learn your craft. You have to know the set. You have to work as a PA. You have to make each step along the way to get to the point where you're qualified to be able to actually make a film, assuming we're talking about directors. But it isn't just jumping in and directing. It's acting. It's learning how actors work. It's learning every job on the set. It's working in production. I think it's knowing how to do a budget and a schedule. I think it's all of those things to build all of your skills so that at some point you're ready to take the next step, whether as an AD or a director, or on the artistic side, an art director, editor, cinematographer, any of those things. But you have to have the building blocks, and you cannot skip the steps. You have to spend time in LA or New York, somewhere where everybody is. You can't start and just be somewhere else and just think they're going to come to you. You can end up there if you want to, live somewhere else. And a lot of people do now, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I don't think you can only be there when you're starting out. You got to be around people like you who are climbing around trying to figure out their life and their work. And you have to work harder. You have to wake up before everybody. You have to go to sleep after everybody. You have to be first on the set and last off the set. You have to listen and not talk a lot for a while. That's another thing. Listen. And, those are my rules. Those are the rules I usually give production assistants. And if they can follow them, I pay attention to them and I give them bigger things to do on the set rather than just run around and do nothing.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Scott, I really do appreciate you joining me and love the conversation. Is there anything, just before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to make sure to promote? Anything you want people to check out? I know you've got a million NDAs just filing, like scrolling through your head right now. Is there anything you could talk about or promote?
I think the first thing is, critical thinking came out last year during the pandemic, which was really a shame. We got, we had a lot going for us. We were, in the ballpark for probably some fairly serious distribution. And we were kind of the, one of the opening night films at South by Southwest 2 years ago. And then everything got shut down, including South by Southwest. And we got picked up for distribution by a nice distributor, Vertical, but it wasn't, it was a VOD release. It wasn't the same as we had hoped for pre-pandemic. And we think we made a fantastic movie. John Leguizamo directed it, starred in it. The guys in it were great. It was a perfect team of people. It was the first family I had felt in a long time. And it was just, it's a beautiful movie that is well reviewed. People keep saying, where is it? I can't see it. And it's here. It's like, it drives me crazy, because so I still want people to see that movie. I guess in a way, maybe we should remake that because not enough people saw it.
Just re-release it. Just pretend. Well, and Leguizamo is just ferociously talented in everything he does.
He was fantastic and great to work with. But, I have a project in the Philippines called Counterplay. I just signed the director, Tarsum Singh, to direct a movie I'm doing called Nanda Devi, which is a spy story set in the United States and India in 1964. I'm working on a movie called The Five about the 500 Club in Atlantic City and the man who ran it called Skinny D'Amato. And that's starting to turn into something pretty big. So there's a bunch of good things that I'm cooking up, a group of television shows, Asian based with Pedring Lopez, who directed Maria and is directing Counterplay to do for streamers. And we're talking right now to a bunch. So there's a lot going on, a lot of good things.
Awesome. Well, everybody listening, be sure to check the show notes for links to some of these projects that are being mentioned. And Scott, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. No, thank you. I know we went a little bit over there, but that's why I always schedule for the hour block. And then, because, you always start talking and those random rounds just wreck people's brains. Try to think of underrated, what's movie, everything goes blank. But thanks for doing it. I really do. It means a lot to me.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
If I think about it, I'll tell you. And I know there is somebody.
I'll get an email in about 5 minutes going, oh, I should have mentioned them. So, but awesome. Well, I'll keep in touch. I'll send over an email when this goes out, so you can see it and share it if you'd like to. And I'll definitely keep an eye on the things you're working on and check them out as well.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Buddy. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Film School podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, don't forget to leave a 5-star review and hit subscribe so you won't miss a single episode.